Besides unit testing, we also have integration and end-to-end testing. And actually, there are other kinds of testing as well, for example, accessibility testing, but these three kinds of tests are the most common and popular forms of automated tests that you will encounter in most pieces of software and most websites. And as a side note, the concept of automated testing is not exclusive to JavaScript. It exists in basically all programming languages, so what you learn here will indirectly also help you with other languages in case you're interested. Now, we did learn about unit testing in the previous lecture. We learned that it's about testing the individual building blocks, functions and classes that make up our application, and that all these building blocks are tested standalone. And the idea, as mentioned in the previous lecture, is that if our building blocks work, the entire application should work. Now, with integration testing, we build up on unit tests, and we actually also test the combination of building blocks, the combination of units. And we verified that if different units are executed together or are working together, the overall app still works as intended. Because the idea is that even if all our building blocks do work correctly individually, once we combine them, they might not work as expected anymore. And I will come back to this idea later in the course, because in this course we'll also take a look at integration testing and see how it's related to unit tests and how you can write integration tests. Now, end-to-end testing then is a different kind of testing, which is not directly related to unit or integration testing. The idea behind end-to-end testing is that you focus on specific user behaviors or specific API interfaces your application might be providing, and you test entire flows, entire application features. For example, if you're building an image upload API endpoint, you might want to test the entire image upload workflow, which includes extracting the image from the incoming request and then storing it on the file system. With unit tests, you would test the individual parts that make up the flow. With integration tests, you might test combinations of those blocks. With end-to-end tests, you would test the entire flow. So with end-to-end tests, you test the actual things real users or programs interacting with your program would do. So therefore, these are the most realistic kinds of tests, you could say, but they also bring their own challenges, and ultimately, you should combine all these kinds of tests in your projects. You should write unit tests, you should then also add some integration tests, and you typically also want to add some end-to-end tests for those important user behaviors and complete processes that take place inside of your app. You want to have unit tests because those allow you to quickly spot and pinpoint breaking changes. With unit tests, it's easy to tell which part of the application is affected by a change because you test all these parts individually. But of course, unit tests do ignore the actual user flows and interferences. Instead, you test these individual building blocks. Now, you do have some combinations with integration testing, but you still only test the combinations you want to test. Therefore, you don't model the entire user behavior flows there, but just selected combinations of units. Now, once you switch to integration testing, it of course becomes a bit harder to spot which exact part or unit of an application broke because of a change, because you're testing the combination of units. Now, with end-to-end tests, as mentioned, you do test those realistic behaviors of users and those realistic flows, those realistic processes that take part of your application. But of course, with end-to-end testing, it becomes tricky to cover all possible behaviors that can be challenging. And if things do go wrong, it of course can take some extra work to find out which exact part of the application broke and which part of the application is causing a certain test to fail. As mentioned, you typically want to add all these kinds of tests, and we have this concept of a testing pyramid where you might want to add a lot of unit tests, basically tests for all your units that make up your app, all your functions and classes, and not just one test per unit, but instead multiple tests per unit, as you will also learn in this course. Then you want to add some integration tests, and you want to have a couple of end-to-end tests for the most important behaviors and processes in your app. This, however, is no hard rule, and there definitely also are people advocating that you should have more end-to-end tests than unit tests. Ultimately, knowing all kinds of tests is a good idea, and with this course, you will learn how to write and add unit and integration tests, which are super important fundamentals you always must know when it comes to writing automated tests for your programs.